Hey everyone, welcome back to our Fusion 360 workshop series. And today we'll be going over the assembly portion of the workshop series, which is the second workshop in the series. And so if you haven't done the basic modeling workshop yet, you got to do that first. It'll be linked below in the description. And if you're on this from a different place, it should be linked around that, or you can go to our YouTube channel and see more about it. So hopefully everyone that's here has done the basic modeling course and you have something that looks like this, and now you're all ready to do assembly. And the reason that assembly is done is because assembly basically allows people to fit all of their parts together, see if they work well together, if they clash or if they overlap. Kind of lets you do some final constraint work before you go to manufacturing. It's also helpful if you're working with a larger team and each person is building one part themselves. You assemble them, make sure they all fit together and look nice together. With that quick explainer, let's go ahead and do some basic assembly work. So the big thing that you need to do initially when you do assembly work is you need to define what part you want to be like your base of your model and what part you want everything else to build off of, because you need to decide which is the base. So it's not going to move anymore. And you can see that if I'm just clicking my objects, right now they're all free moving, and they just move in whatever direction. And I don't want that to be the case. So for our case, I think it makes sense just because the training train body is kind of the biggest model and everything else is built off of it. We should just use that as our base. So we want this to never move again. So the way that we can do that is we can go ahead and click our training train body in our browser here. We can go ahead and right click and hit ground. And if I ground it, I can see this little push pin right here in my component view to a degree. And if I try and drag it, it won't move around anymore. So it's now rigid in place there, and everything else, when we attach them later, they'll stick to this part and then they'll become rigid themselves. And then the next part of getting everything attached is we just want to make sure that we attach everything else. So since our slot or our cabin is already in the slot that we want it to, we don't really have to do any movement to it. So we're going to go ahead and select our training train cabin or training train body and our training train cabin. And we can go up to this assemble part in our toolbar, and we can go ahead and make these a rigid group, which just locks their positions together. And they'll be treated as a single object. So they'll lock together and they'll be in the place that we want them to. So we're going to go ahead and just lock those with the rigid group right now. And just for now, we'll say capture position because we don't want to move these two back to their original position, and they're the only ones that moved, and they're fine where they are now. If you want to, you can revert position, but for our case, we don't have to worry about that, so we'll just capture the current position. We already selected these two, so they're already a rigid group, and it asks if we want to include child components. In our case, we don't have any children components of our bodies or our cabin, but in the future, or if you do have children, that's a concept up to you. In our case, we don't have children, but even if we did have children, I wouldn't want those to also be included, depending on what they are. So I'm going to go ahead and uncheck this box. Then I'm just going to select OK. And now these two are attached together. And we have our baseline model done for the cabin, and it's now attached to our body. So the next thing we want to do is we should probably just attach our cabin top. So the way that we can do that is generally when you're working with assembly files, they're built off of joints. So it's selecting somewhere on the object to join to another specific part of the object. And for our case, we want this frame to be joined right to the middle of this space. But we don't actually have any place here that this can fit nicely into. There's no if I try and make a joint here or click a joint here, there's no middle point right here essentially. So in order to fix that, we're going to have to create a joint origin ourselves. So to do that, we can go ahead and go into the assembly and do a joint origin, which allows us to create a new joint point that we can work with. And to do that, we can just go ahead, and it's on snap. So we just basically need to select a point, and then we can do a simple thing. In our case, the easiest way to probably do it is we have this circle that's already in our center. So we're just going to use that as our initial point. And then we're just going to offset it. So it's offset right to the top. And so we know that we cut this circle down 2.5, and then that the top of like the cabin is 40 millimeters from the top of the slot. So if we set the offset to 42.5, it should be right at the top. And we can look and check and double check, and that looks perfectly at the top to me. So I'm just going to select OK. And now we have a joint origin here in the middle that we can work with. And so now that we have this joint origin in the middle, we can go ahead and work with jointing this part, this cabin top, to the cabin itself. So first thing I want to do is, much like constraints, joints work in a similar way, where you want to select the object you are joining to the object it needs to be joined to. So I'm going to go ahead and select our cabin top first, and then I'm going to go ahead and select that joint origin that we just created, and we'll go ahead and select that, and we can see that they're locked together now, and they look perfectly aligned to me, so we don't have to worry about like offsetting any X, Y, Z, anything like that. Don't need to do an angle. And before we select OK, there's a couple, we're going to look at the other tab of joint. So there's a position tab and there's a motion tab. And position is just focusing on selecting your points together and getting them connected. But motion kind of acts like how you can choose motion between your points essentially. So rigid just means that they'll be locked together and they won't be able to be pulled apart. And you can just preview that motion by clicking this plus, and it'll keep going until I hit stop. But in our case, we want it to be a slider instead. So we're going to go ahead and do a slider, because then it can act like the top is being basically taken on and off. But we don't want it to basically go through all the way up and all the way down through the floor. So we need to set some limits to it. So the minimum I'm going to set to 0, so it can't go past that joint origin. And the maximum, I don't want it to go super far, so I'm going to do like 40 millimeters. That looks about a good distance. You can do 50, something like that. Just anywhere in the range of like 30 to 50 probably is a good setting. So I'm just going to go ahead and do 40. And then we can just preview the limits to make sure it's in like an acceptable space. And that looks good to me. So I'm just going to go ahead and stop the preview and just click OK. And now we have that joint there. So essentially I can only bring it up and down because it's now connected to the part itself. So that's the beginning of our joint origin for our cabin top. And it looks like I didn't set it all the way down particularly. So just go ahead and do that. And now it looks like it's fully on. And the next thing we want to do is do some basic, we want to bring our smokestack into the piece itself or into its slot that exists in. So I'm just going to do another joint. I will select the bottom of the smokestack, and then I will select the bottom center points of this thing, so the top of the screw head essentially. And one thing that you can see when we're looking at this, we can see how our X, Y, and Z are oriented. So we can see that our Z is pointing up. So we generally want to kind of align those two. We also want our Z to be oriented in the same way. And there we go. But I can see that it's still on my slider motion, and I don't want that. I want this one to be rigid. So I'm just gonna, because I don't want this one to move at all. because when it is screwed in, we don't want any motion from there. So we can just click OK. And now it should be set into its spot. And now we have all of our baseline components added in. So now we want our train to look fully complete. So we're going to insert a couple components and insert external components into our current design. So the way that we can do that depends on a couple different methods. So if you want to insert an existing Fusion file, you can go ahead into your data panel and you can go and select a specific project. You'll go ahead and find your design. In our case, we're going to insert our training train wheel, which is a file that should be linked in the description that everyone can download and add to their Fusion libraries. So when you find the part that you want to insert, you can go ahead and right click it and click insert into current design. And if you insert it, it then appears in the design right here. So we can see that we have our training train wheel, and we can go ahead and click OK to insert it. And now we have the wheel just existing in our current design. So we can go ahead and we want to joint these wheels to the place where they're supposed to go on the threads. So I'm going to go ahead and create a joint, select the wheel itself, and then select the hole. And now that I got that, it should be in place. And just again, try and make sure you align your stuff. If it isn't aligned, you can always flip to make sure it's in the right place. And then instead of rigid motion for this one, I want them to revolute so it looks like the wheels are turning. So, and then I just want my rotation to stay on the z-axis because I want them to rotate around this center point right here. And then I can just preview the motion and we can see that it's moving in time now. So we can go ahead and stop that, click OK. And we want 6 of these wheels, so we can just go ahead and unfortunately, the quickest way to do it is usually, because if you just copy the component, you'll have issues of it's not being its own part and it will just be a mesh. So if you copy the component, we'll have issues. So we're going to go ahead and just drag 4 or 5 more of them in. So we'll go ahead, insert into current design. And we'll just do that 5 more times. So I'm just gonna keep going until we insert all 5 of them. And 1 more to go. And then we should be good with our wheels. Okay. And then we're just gonna keep doing that same joints we had done before and make sure that they're revolute. And I need to make sure it's flipped. And then motion, I will actually want to go ahead. And the problem that you face if you flip it or run into axes is they won't properly rotate in the right way that we want them to. So we need to make sure that we actually set them up all in the same way, or they won't revolve in the way that we want them to. And sometimes it's really finicky. That's not what I wanted. So just be patient, and especially when dealing with threads, there's a lot of objects there, so it can be a challenge. And you can always zoom in, and that should always help. And that is offset still, so we're just gonna create the joint and go ahead and be very careful with it. And I'm just going to go ahead and work on this, and I will speed through this part on my video, and I'll meet you back when we're done with this part. Okay, and now that we're at this part, we're gonna do the same thing for the other side and just make sure that they're all assembled. And one quick tip that you can do is if you do end up on an edge of a part and you want to go to the middle, you can always hit Control and that will allow you to shift your point. Click OK, just keep going. And then I just have one more to do. And there we go. Now that we're done with those, we can go ahead and do some motion links because we want all of these to rotate together. So in order to do that, we can add this thing called motion links. And basically, motion links will join the motion of two joints together. And so now that we have that one done, we can just go ahead and click OK. And then we want to motion link all from the same starting one. So we always want to select this front right as our first one, and then motion link every other one to it. And then we'll go ahead and motion link the other side, except for on the second side, we need them to be reversed so that they move in the same direction. Actually, no, they don't need to be reversed. And we can go ahead and do the last motion link then. And there we go. They should all be motion linked together. And now that we have this part done, we're just going to go ahead and we want to add our screws now, but we don't have a 3D model of our screws that we've made. But there's this really handy feature that if you have McMaster-Carr components that we're working with, it allows you to import those. So you can go into Insert, Insert McMaster-Carr component, and it'll bring up McMaster-Carr's catalog. So we're going to go ahead, we're going to use a tapping screw, and we'll do 8/18. And then we want M3.5, and we want 13mm ones. And we will go ahead and you can see that it allows us to give a CAD file of it. So we want a CAD step file, hit download, and it allows us to bring that component within our drawing. So go ahead, now that we have one, we can go ahead and do the joint for the top of our smokestack, and we'll go ahead and insert that one in, and then we will just repeat adding it in again through the McMaster car components, and just make sure we set our motion type to rigid this time for these. And let's go ahead and keep inserting them through the McMaster car, same way, screw and bolt, a tapping screw, and then an 818, and then you'll set your size on the side, a 3.5 by 13, and then just make sure you can get to the step file, and then hit download, and just repeat that process until you have all 7 of them inserted and all 6 or all of them attached to our wheels. So I'm just going to speed through this on the video, and I'll meet you back when we're done with this part. Okay, now that we've completed all of that, all of our assemblies drawing is done, and everything should all work together in a motion link. All of our pieces are combined. We can bring them all together. It looks like everything fits. We have no issues with any of our tolerances or anything like that. So Yeah, that's all the basics of the 3D model or the 3D Fusion 360 assembly process and the training train model. I hope you guys come back to do the drafting portion next. Thanks a lot for watching.